Hey everyone, thanks for joining me. Today, we're going to talk about how to document customer success processes and how to do it in alignment with best in class practices. Documenting processes for customer success can take a lot of shapes and forms. I've worked with a lot of different clients, and every time I see the process being documented completely differently. But there is a consistent way of doing it, and there are some areas that you really need to think about when you document the process so that it becomes sticky, it gets adopted, and it becomes a really good process. You want to do that even before you put it in a system so that the process can actually be followed in a consistent manner across all your customer success managers. And so I invited Pedro Candelas, who is the senior customer success operations manager at a company called Elastic in British Columbia. And the reason I invited him is not only because he's a customer success operations manager, but he's been doing that for 7 years. And before that, he has a really interesting background. He actually worked for a number of different industries as an industrial engineer. And he's been doing that for 14 years in different industries. So if there's anybody who knows how to document processes and how to optimize them, that's Pedro. Pedro, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back with examples, workflow charts, specific templates that you can implement in your own organization. And by the end of this discussion with Pedro, you're going to be armed with lots of tips and tactical advice that you can take to your own organization and improve your customer success operations. So before we start, just tell me a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? Like originally?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Mexico, from a town called Mexicali, which is in the north of Mexico, 2 hours east drive from San Diego. But now I'm currently in Vancouver. I've been in Vancouver for the last 4 years, a little bit over 4 years. I came here with a company that brought me and decided to sponsor me. I was a customer support manager when I moved here. I was working remote for the same company. I actually did a value stream mapping. So my boss asked me, like, can you run this? Because I'm an industrial engineer. So I run a value stream mapping. And then while I was here, like he liked what I did. And he's like, oh, do you like it? Do you want to stay? So get all your documentation ready. And yeah, and here I am.
Pedro, before we dive into what you've done and like this whole amazing project that you've done and all these outcomes, I've been working with a lot of companies, and every time I ask for process documentation, I see something else. Since you're coming from industrial engineering background, in your opinion, from your experience, what is process documentation and what is best practices around that?
Process documentation is having a place where you can access the processes that affect your day to day. There's two big mistakes that all the companies do. It's either over document or under document. It's a little bit of an art to figure out how much documentation you have to have. Startups in general, they tend not to have a lot of documentation. There's a few documentation here. It's rarely standardized. Every department has their own way to document processes. And on the other hand, bigger corporations, they suffer from over documenting. So they want to have every single detail. And that's a problem in the long run if you are facing audits. Like if you have a SOC compliance or an ISO compliance audit, like if you over document it, when the auditor comes and they will see like, oh, you have to do exact these 5 steps by this person that you probably put the name of that person is no longer there, and you get a finding. You have to be in that place where you have your processes documented, but then there has to be a little bit of ambiguity that allows you to be flexible, because then your organization will become too rigid. As I said, some of the best practices is keeping the document simple and concise. Have a document control plan in place, meaning someone who takes ownership of the documentation to keep it standard, to keep it in the format, to keep control of versions. You have to keep different documentation for every different process. Don't try to have like a master document where you have all the processes in one single document, because it also brings another type of challenges. Avoid covering the entire organization at once. As I said, like you should not try to document the company-wide processes in one single document. Other thing is that you have to make them available for everyone. So like a single repository or either a Google Drive where you have access to that documentation, a wiki, or whatever you want to use, but it has to be available for everyone. So everyone can go and access to that documentation. You have to make sure that it complies to whatever certification you're applying. If you're interested in going there, you are a SOC compliant or an ISO, or maybe a supplier or a vendor or a buyer requires you to be certified by their standards. Like you have to make sure that your documentation is complying to the requirements. And then the least important is you have to create a process for creating processes. So you have to document your process of documenting processes, because if you don't start with that process, then everything will fall apart. I think it's one of the most important things, that you have to have process for creating processes.
Okay, so do you have an example? Can you show how you documented the process for documentation? If you liked what you've heard so far, that's awesome. More coming in a second here, but in the meantime, I want you to click that like button so that YouTube knows that this is great content and you can start sharing it with others.
So to document the process, there's a very easy steps to do that. So one is defining the process and its scope. So you need to be very precise of which document or which process you want to document. You can't be too open and too wide. We're documenting standard operating procedures. So we're not documenting how the company operates. We're just documenting, okay, I need to create a CTA. So what's the process? Creating a CTA. And what's the scope? A CS CTA that is for risk management. We define the process and the scope. Second step, it's you have to organize the steps. So what I typically do is I walk the process. So I sit with someone, or if I'm the expert, I'll just run through the process and document or see the steps that I have to do to get to there. Then I have to see if my interactions or my process touches any other people in the team. So I have to also address who's involved with my process. And then sometimes, of course, there's exceptions. So you have to add or note if there's any exceptions in the process. There's always exceptions, so you will probably have some to add notes on that. And then you have to have also very important part of engineering is control points or validations. What happens at this point when you're writing the process, you need to figure out at what point, if something's going wrong, they will allow you to notice that something's going wrong or not. So you have to include those. And then at the end, like basically you just run the process to make sure that what you documented in the document that you created is actually going to deliver what it's meant to. And what I typically do is I just give it to someone, like, can you do this process on your own without help? If that person is able to achieve that goal of whatever the process was meant, creating a CTA, then I consider that's a well-documented process. So it's always good that if you have a second person who checks what you documented to make sure that it makes sense, that the wording is correct, process is actually telling you what to do, that you're achieving what is expected to achieve.
Wanted to say I really like step number 5, add control points. I think it's not just adding control points for having somebody review your own process documentation, but also making sure that as you create the process, I mean, you can document the process as is, but usually when we look to optimize the process, we add control points to the process we're documenting, because I think that's really normally the fail point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Typically, it's something that we all overlook. And I've seen many documentations or many process documentation where like the control points are not included. And if you don't have those control points, then you're not really setting yourself for success, or you're not setting that process for success, because something that doesn't have control points, it's going to end up being uncontrolled. It's kind of like a engineering jargon word. Kind of like we know that if something's not being taken under control, it's going to end up like being completely different process, because people will find shortcuts, then we'll just go around them. So yeah, if you don't have control points, you're not setting up the process for success.
Do you have an example of a process you recently documented where you had some control points so we can kind of illustrate that to the audience? Before we continue, don't forget, subscribe to our YouTube channel and smash that notification button so that you don't miss out on any new videos. So when you look at this, what would you have changed? This is a process where you would campaign into your customer base. Let's say you have 30, 50, 100 customers as a CSM, and you're doing some sort of like a proactive outreach to teach them about a new feature or a new module that you think they might be interested in. So start, call the customer. If they answer, you discuss the campaign topic with a customer using the talk track call script. If they're interested, then you give it to the sales team, send a thank you, perform a follow up, right? Like all of this stuff. What would you have changed in terms of everything you've discussed before?
Well, something that's missing here is like the interactions with the other teams. Like this seems to be like it's the same person doing everything. So one of the things is, for instance, if you're going to discuss it with sales, you need to highlight that process, and that should be transferable to when you move it to a document. That you have to describe what happens and what you're expecting from that interaction with that third party that you're working with. As we just discussed earlier, the control points, I don't think there's a control point here. Yeah, like you're not validating if the process actually worked. You're just considering that it's the end. Like, yeah, you finalize it and that's it. You're not including that part of the process. It's good. Like as I said, everything has potential for improvement. So like for instance, if you want to improve this process, then you will have to add like time frames when this has to happen, kind of like moving into like a value stream, meaning how many interactions you do a day, how often, where are your bottlenecks, and that will help you in the long run improve the process. As a general way to document the process, it's good, but it requires a little bit more to make process to be part of a documentation.
Okay, so let me see if I can recap. From a workflow standpoint, you would have added also like, oh, I'll show an example. So this one at least has the difference between a CSM and a salesperson. The CSM does all these things, and then what do they expect from the salesperson? So you could see kind of like maybe like a better example of the difference between the activities of the CSM versus the salesperson.
Exactly. You have to show those interactions. And of course, there's different ways to visualize it. Well, Streamlanes is perfect. I'll say it's like the most common one. Sometimes just noting who's the owner. Color coding works as well. But yeah, like showing where it moves from one department to the other, like process, because not all the processes will be within just one, which is one department, especially customer success processes. You touch sales, you touch renewals team. If you have, you touch support. You can't really show that you're doing everything because you're actually interacting with other teams. So it's important to highlight where all those other teams are part of the process.
And these are just the workflow charts. So, in addition to workflow charts, I think what you're saying is that we actually need to document the entire process. What are the different things that you have? And do you have an example of a process that you documented, or at least a template that you typically use, just to break down the different elements of what you would recommend any customer success operations manager to use when they're thinking about documenting a process so that they have all the pieces in place?
So this is standard operating procedure template I recently created for the company I work for. It's very standard. You'll find something similar almost everywhere if you Google. You don't have to be very creative. There's a lot of things already created for us, so you don't have to spend a lot of time inventing the wheel. So SOP, basically standard operating procedure name, how you're gonna call that process. You have to have an effectivity date when that date becomes effective. You have to keep revision control, meaning when was the last revision done, and then a number. You can use 1.0, 1.x, or A's, or whatever you decide. And then the authors. And this is important because if you need to review, it's important to have who created that document, because you will always have a person to ask why or how it's documented. And that's something that is very common that we overlook in tech, because everything is like on Google Sheets or whatever, and then you never record who created the document. You just save the document, the folder, and then just leave it there, and then you really don't know unless you go through the settings of the document to see who created that document. Sometimes that person is no longer there, so it's important to have who created the document. Then you keep a version control. Doesn't have to be very sophisticated. Just you start with the initial release, like the first time you create it, and then every single change that you do to the document, you will add anything that happened. Like if you change, maybe you change the roles, or there was an update on the UI they were using, so you need to add the new screenshots or something like that. Like you will have to document. Then typically you have approvers. You will have either your manager or your peers to approve it, just to make sure that it complies to the documents, to the whole structure. Then you have to describe a purpose. You have to describe what's the purpose of the process and what's the background, meaning we are documenting this process because this and that happened in the past and we're trying to prevent that from happening again, or people are not doing this, so we are preventing for people not doing it anymore. So you have to add the purpose, a scope, as I said, what and whom are applies. It could be the process, it could be team members. And this is something you should be a little bit ambiguous. Don't put Pedro needs to do this. Just leave it like, oh, the CSM role it's responsible of. That's important because you don't want to change the document every time there's someone who leaves the company or they win the lottery and then they just stop working for you. You don't want to change the documents every single time. Prerequisites, you have to add any information that is preceding to the procedure. So maybe you need to add information from other sources. You need to check some other processes to be aware of, or you need to check logs or something like that. Like it's important that you highlight those so that when the person starts doing the process, they know exactly what they will need. It's like the parts list of when you're building or putting together an IKEA furniture. You need to know what's there. Responsibilities. This is important because here you will highlight where or who, sorry, is the person who's actually responsible of executing the process. And as I said, don't put names, just make it as the role. Like the CSM is responsible of creating a CTA, and then the SDR is responsible of replying to you. Be very, very ambiguous. Don't put names because then you will have to change.
Yeah, that's a common mistake. I think it's really important that you brought it up.
Yeah, I've seen it multiple times and I've been through ISO audits where like there were names of internal people who were like long gone from the company and then you got a finding. And it's an easy fix, but no one wants to have a finding.
And what about the procedure? That's just a box there. Is there best practices on how you describe the procedure? Says include a process flow chart and then step by step. Where do you highlight the timeline? Like, it doesn't look like you have a format to make sure that you describe the step by step in the detail that you discussed.
So procedures are very flexible. The process of documenting the procedure is what is to be documented, but it depends on the style of the company. Some companies have very robust documentation. So like the most obvious thing is just describing step by step the process, and then you add the flowchart as a support of because people will sometimes understand better with flowchart. Some people understand by instructions. So you just have to go in a linear way of how to do things on that process. So for instance, if we're using a CSM tool and you need to create a CTA, you don't have to go deep to like open, let's say, open Gainsight and click on home and then go to the cockpit. You don't have to be that specific, but you can say like once you're in the cockpit, click on the plus button to create a new CTA, and then you describe the steps of what you have to fill in that CTA.
And then what about templates that you use? How about a business process versus a system process? If you have like a business process, how do you do a QBR or how do you reach out for a customer when there's an escalation? Do you typically also include links to email templates? What are your best practices in order to scale that operation?
You always have to add references to what everything that you're documenting. We have this other field here where all the related processes related policies and supporting documentation that needs to be connected to this document. So yeah, everything has to be included here. And try not to document the templates within the procedure because if there's a change on the template, you have to change the procedure as well. So try to keep them apart, have a different control process for the templates. It could also be under document control. So you have a proper control of all your templates for emails, for version control of all your templates, and then just reference the procedure for that general template. Don't document the templates in the process.
That's great. Okay, so once you're done documenting the process, who do you show it to and who do you get the buy-in to actually use the process?
In my case, or the CS world, I'll typically work with the directors and some SMEs within the organization. So, like, I create a process, I'll validate with a select group of CSMs who are like the ones we're going to use it at the end, and then just make sure that what I describe is capturing everything that needs to be done. And wording, as you know, many of us are English as second language. So sometimes wording needs to be improved. Yeah, so we work with them. And then finally, typically the director or the person who's overseeing the team is the one who approves the process.
What happens after it approves? You take the document, do you put it in a library or do you just put it in your customer success software?
We put it in the library, and it could be either a Google Drive or it could be a more sophisticated document control tool.
What do you use, Pedro?
We use Wiki. We use a
Use
Wiki.
Wiki.
Yeah,
Okay. Do you convert this into an HTML page?
correct. We convert this into an HTML page and we have it on a wiki. Same format, just a wiki. So everyone has access. The CSM team has access to the wiki. The version control is also a little bit tied to the person who uploaded it. So we have that tracking as well. And yeah, that we use wiki.
Just so you know, clients that I worked with, if they're a Google shop, I typically recommend using Google Sites as your wiki so you don't have to buy a new tool. And if you're a Microsoft shop, the two most used tools that I have seen are SharePoint and Confluence.
Oh yeah, I work with all three. I'll say depends on the organization. Confluence has worked in companies where are very heavy into using Jira because there's like that world, at least in my experience. When there's not that heavy in like agile front, I'll say I'll prefer Google Sites because everyone is in Google Sites. So I have no preference. They all work similar. They all deliver the same features basically.
Yeah, I have the same impression. Okay, so once you published it on your wiki page, like I've seen a lot of companies document a process or optimizing it, but then the process never gets adopted. In your most successful newly published processes, what do you think made some of them stickier than others? Like, what are the things that you've done, the team has done, the manager has done, or the way you documented it? What do you think? What's your like main takeaways on what makes a process sticky?
I feel like when it's a full change, it makes them stickier. When it's just a tweak to the process, it's harder in terms of change management to adopt it because it's more prone to for mistakes. Because if it's, let's say, all the process is exactly the same and there's one last thing that changed, it's harder for CSMs or persons, humans, to be aware of that change
Or change habits,
or change
basically.
habits correctly. But some of the things that I've been exploring on doing is how you make it harder to stay on the previous process, how you sunset or remove the previous process, and how you don't make it available or not unavailable. That's something that I've been exploring and it's been working. I don't have much experience so far that I can say, oh yeah, this is the way to go. But I've been trying to sunset the processes that we're replacing. It just make it harder for them to go through that other process.
Well, I feel like this conversation was really great for anybody in customer success operations that wants to have a consistent approach to documenting processes. And like step number one, make a standard of operations, an SOP template in place. And it's something that works for you. Find a place where you can document or push or publish all of these processes and then follow the steps you suggested earlier in the videos. For each process, how do you work on it until it gets published?
Yeah. And then I guess like not last, but it's important that we do process engineering, I call it. So how you improve that process.
And I think that might be like a next video because I think that there's so much to cover just on how do you even document an existing one, let alone like all the approaches on how to optimize it. And I would like to invite you to do another video with me just on taking a horrible process that doesn't work, constantly generates issues, and how do you approach step by step the optimization, including, like you said, a big challenge. How do you make people change their behavior? To kind of like touch on how do you sunset the old process just to make sure that there is a success. And maybe we can walk through an example of how you approach that at your own previous companies. All right, everyone, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like. Stay tuned and subscribe to this YouTube channel so when the next video with Pedro comes up around how to optimize processes, you're going to get that notification. And that's it for today, Pedro. You've been absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed getting to know you and learning from you on how to document processes for customer success operations. Thank you so much.